What's Whatu, it's Tim Tafunga. Today is the 20th of May, 2026. It's a it's a it's a Thursday morning here in Brisbane. It's just before 9 a.m. So I'm gonna have a quick chat about the current fluid situation that's happening right at this very moment that involves my people, the Samoans. The recent assassination of the coconut cartel kingpin Lorenzo Lemalu that has happened in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam that occurred on May the 21st last week, which has great cultural implications to Samoans such as myself here in Australia. Now, I don't know the finer details of the coconut cartel and its relationship with the Alameddine Arab drugs and the bikie gangs and the drug trafficking cartels within Sydney and throughout Australia. Suffices to say, I can only give my Samoan Australian purview from a cultural perspective. Bearing in mind the recent changes of the political environment with the rise of right-wing nationalism, the recent hate crimes laws that have been passed in the federal government that impinges upon all multicultural Australia, in particular that we are all tarred by the same brush with the antics of Islamic jihadists, the pro-Palestinians antics that have undermined multiculturalism, especially for Christian Polynesian Pacific Island groups that are tarred by the same brush of the antics of the Arabs, the Hezbollah antics within Australian society from Iranian war, anti-Semitic Arabs who are here in Australia causing a ruckus, bringing their wars to our shores. Now, I lived in Australia for 45 years, migrated from New Zealand, born in New Zealand, in Christchurch, New Zealand. And back in the 60s, we migrated to Australia. As soon as the White Australia policy had ended with the Racial Discrimination Act during Gough Whitlam's administration, and its time reconciliation with the Aboriginal people, as well as bringing in multiculturalism with the end of White Australia policy in 1975 with the Racial Discrimination Act that was passed through the federal government. Now, what has happened since? Now, in 1970s, this is where the underbelly assimilation of the Pacific Islanders, such as the KVT and the Coconut Cartel, have assimilated to the underbelly culture of Australia. These people were drawn into the underbelly cultures through bikie gangs and through sports of all things, with steroids readily available for NRL prospects, for rugby league players, for sports athletes, Pacific Islanders who wanted to improve their social standing and celebrity status throughout Australian and New Zealand society through sports. So what did they do? They took steroids for performance enhancement so that they could get into the NRL clubs of choice, and through the illegal supply chains of steroids, through their underbelly world linkages, they were embroiled in the culture of the underbelly world. Now, back in the 70s, Australia was talking about the Mr Asia of the Marty Johnstons and the Terry Clark, Mr Asia of New Zealand, who had introduced that similar subculture of a New Zealander who started off with marijuana and then increased the heroin supplies throughout Australia and New Zealand. Now, Terry Clark and Marty Johnston, otherwise known as Mr. Asia, the famous Kiwi kingpin of drug supplies from Asia, namely from China, had brought in illicit drugs into Australia throughout the 70s until his untimely death in 1983. That was Terry Clark when he died in 1983, but he had built a dynasty of drugs in Australia throughout all the underbelly world of drugs, cartels, the linkages with New Zealand. Now, 2026, fast forward, the Golden Triangle still exists in Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and elsewhere. The lessons learned from the Vietnam War, and that's why it seems very timely that the assassination of Lorenzo Lemalu in Ho Chi Minh City coincide with the history of the Vietnam War and the Vietnam vets from America and New Zealand that returned from the Vietnam War who were drug addicts. Now, who initiated the drug trades in America and Australia and New Zealand was the burgeoning rise of black gangs. A lot of them were ex-Vietnam vets who set up groups called the Crips and the Bloods. Now, these gangs had a spread throughout all over had spread throughout all of. Sorry, I need to take this off. Right. Okay, where are we? Now, these gangs had spread throughout South Central LA and throughout America. Now, these were Vietnam vets who formed Bloods and Crips in America. Now, that was the mid-60s through the early 70s. With them, the Golden Triangle of heroin trafficking started to grow. Now, in Australia and New Zealand, who were the first drug dealers in Australia and New Zealand? They were Vietnam vets. Now, this culture, this tradition of drug trafficking linked to soldiers is very real. Now, Afghanistan is another example of how heroin and opium had also spread amongst military soldiers. Now, in Fort Bragg in the United States of America, they call it the Fort Bragg cartel, where a lot of American soldiers were all dealing with ice, methamphetamine, speed, and heroin and opium. The opium was supplied by Afghanistan. They were selling them to other fellow soldiers within Fort Bragg. Most of them were special forces because these guys were linked with the Taliban and they established networks. So, how does this tie back to Ho Chi Minh City? Simple. The Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle, like Mr. Asia in the 70s, is now the KVT, the Alameddine, the Arab linkages and gangs of the Mongols, Comancheros, Hells Angels, and all the networks that are distributors of drugs have spread throughout Australia. Now, that's also includes the current Operation Southern Spear in Central America, with the recent apprehension of President Maduro after the Venezuelan campaign, and Operation Absolute Resolve, the capture of Maduro. Under under the reasoning that President Maduro was selling narcotics to America. Now, that's under the narco war, which is Operation Southern Spear. There were illicit drugs being trafficked from Central and South America to Australia via Fiji, Tonga, Vanuatu, and the Solomon Islands. Now, the linkage with the Golden Triangle are not linked, but they are all part of the drug trafficking phenomena that is now burgeoning at the moment, particularly in the Pacific Islands. But what are they linked to? Well, they're linked to military personnel, soldiers. Now, a lot of Australians diggers were at Afghanistan. There's a Taliban link there. During the early 2000s, the biggest opium fields was in Helmand province in Kandahar. Who were there? Now, they were run by Taliban Pashtunis. Now, who were there? Australia, and Britain. Now, interesting footnote on the history of drugs and drug trades. You would say that the first drug dealers that made a global trade of drugs was the British. The British introduced opium to the Chinese during the Dutch, the East, the East Indian Company of Britain had its own army, and they traded for tea and silks and spices, and especially tea from China. And the only way they could trade with the Chinese was with giving the Chinese opium. So the British were the original drug dealers, the English. So that was they introduced opium from India. That was during the Qing dynasty. They got sick of the drugs, the opium that's coming into China. And so in 1839, the first Opium War commenced. And the successful defeat of the Chinese by the British and the French led to Hong Kong being won by the British. And for over 100 years, Hong Kong was British. And that was simply because of the results of the Opium Wars. The first Opium War was 1839 to 1842. The second Opium War was in 1859 to 1860. That was the war where they led to the unequal Treaty of Nanjing that included handing over Hong Kong to the British. Now, for 100 years, the British had won that by conquest, and the uneven treaty with the Qing dynasty. So drugs was something that the English were experts at. I mean, they were so expert in drugs that Queen Victoria was a heroin addict. So when you talk about drugs, that's where the British are notorious for what they've introduced to the world. Now, the British had defeated the Chinese through opium, and that was they introduced drugs to the Chinese. Now, that's the same with Samoa and Fiji and Tonga at the moment, where drugs are burgeoning and growing via Australia and the Mongols, the Comancheros, Hells Angels, and other drug trafficking networks that have introduced drugs into Samoa and Tonga and Fiji. Now, who are the new conduits, the new Mr. Asias? Well, that was Lorenzo Lemalu. Now, what is the problem with this case of the assassination by two purportedly and allegedly two Samoans who were hired from dubious sources to do a hit on the Kingpin. Now, that's almost not dissimilar to the assassination of Marty Johnston by Terry Clark, Mr. Asia, in the late 70s, where he got his former boss, the former kingpin of the drug trade here in Australia, Marty Johnston, who went to Scotland. He was assassinated by a hired hitman. Now, the interesting part about this is where Australia is in trouble, is that the fake Australian passport that was given to the two Samoans, you cannot counterfeit an Australian passport simply because of the biometric microchip authentication systems within an Australian passport, which means that whoever gave the passport to the Samoans is somebody within the Australian Passport Office, authorized by somebody either from the Australian Federal Police or some law enforcement linked person, because there is no way our non-governmental elements, criminal elements, are able to infiltrate the Australian Passport Office to circulate and to sell counterfeit or fake Australian passports. And no one can duplicate that technology. It's near impossible. Therefore, it is a national security risk that an Australian passport was duplicated and a fake passport was given to the Samoans. Now, that in itself needs to be escalated to the Australian Prime Minister's office for immediate investigations, because a fake Australian passport would mean that all the biometric technologies, the biometric authentication and the polymer paper and everything has to be redone. Otherwise, you can have illegal immigrants, you can have terrorists coming into Australia carrying Australian passports. Now, that's the problem. Now, bringing back to this matter of the current two Samoans who are in Vietnam, who will most likely serve a minimum of 15 years imprisonment to about 20 years to life. They won't be executed because they didn't murder a Vietnamese national. They murdered an Australian. So in that case, it's not a Vietnamese issue, but what they did do was carry illegal firearms in the country and committed violence and murder in Vietnam. But they did not murder a Vietnamese national. Therefore, they won't be given the capital punishment. So that is all I have to say for this moment in time. And we'll keep tabs on what is happening. But the point is that the rise of the ultra right wing here in Australia with Pauline Hanson's One Nation, and although the hate laws have been passed, the National Socialist Network has just changes their stripes. They change their colors, but they're very much in power. They're growing day by day. Secondly, just to point out the fact that the National Socialist Network, or the White Australia groups that are still rising in Australia and ever more popular, they also are in a segue with the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamic jihadism that is also growing here in Australia. Now, you can see it's growing in Britain, in Britannistan, in Britain, and Londistan in Britain. The Lord Mayor of London is Islamic, and he encouraged all the Muslims throughout London, and it's become normalized. And even anti-Semitism has become normalized. It's become so normalized that there is now a Palestinian embassy in London, whereas Israel is now being pushed aside in the ultimate institutionalized and normalization of anti-Semitism with the anti-Israel Weltgeist throughout Europe and the Islamic world. Now, the thing about the Islamics is like Syria, as you watch the Syrian situation today, in Syria, the ISIS had changed their name to ISIL, who were previously known as Al-Qaeda, but they are the same people. Now, that's the same, they're the same people. Now they're called the Syrian Rebel Army. Then in 2026, the Syrian Rebel Army became the Syrian government. They even changed their flag from red, white, and black to green, white, and black. And their president of Syria, the current president of Syria, was a former commander in the Al-Qaeda network. Now, who are the Al-Qaeda network? Well, they're the same people that plowed planes into the World Trade Center. Now they're flipping the script and saying that the Israelis did that, and they're saying that Palestine is the true Arab state of Palestine, and that the Israelis and the Jews are foreign invaders from Europe. And that's the narrative by the European Nazis and the Islamic jihadists in Palestine and throughout the world, here in Australia as well. Even the Bondi shooting, these people were saying the same narrative. Unfortunately, there's over 1 million Muslim Arabs here in Australia. There's over 5 million Arabs, Muslims in Britain. They are very aggressive and controlling the narrative for anti-Semitism, that they have normalized their anti-Semitic views, that most are papist states who are also sharing the pro-Palestinian narrative. The pro-Palestinian movement are mainly promulgated by papist states such as Spain, France, Germany, and Italy. They're all pro-Palestine. They're all anti-Semitic. President Trump knows that. All of the Zionist evangelical Christians know all that. So drawing back to the current situation where the rise of the Pauline Hanson networks and the ultra right wing is popular now, that also leads back to the assimilation narrative by Pauline Hanson. That also includes the coconut cartel, who've become assimilated to the underbelly world of the subcultural levels of criminality that the New Zealanders, the white New Zealanders, had pioneered since the Vietnam War in Australia with Mr Asia, Terry Clark, and Marty Johnston. Now we have the Lorenzo Lemalus of 2026, who are the Samoan version of Mr Asia. So on that note, we'll end our discussion. Ia manuia le soifua ma fufuanga ma le tutorial nei vai aso, to fa soifua